on the 3rd of July, 1908, in the basement storeroom of a ruined Minoan palace on the southern coast of Crete, an Italian archaeologist named Luigi Pernier lifted a small clay disc from the earth and held it up to the Mediterranean light. The disc was roughly 15 centimeters in diameter, about the size of a small saucer. It was made of fine clay, fired to a warm terracotta brown, and it was covered on both sides with symbols arranged in a tight spiral pattern, running from the outside edge inward toward the center. The symbols were not scratched or incised into the clay, as was typical of every other known ancient inscription on Crete. They had been stamped, pressed into the wet clay by individual punches, each bearing a distinct pictographic sign, in the same way that a modern printer stamps letters onto a page. Pernier turned the disc over. The other side was identical in structure. Another spiral, another sequence of stamped symbols, separated into groups by vertical lines, scratched into the clay between clusters of signs. He counted the groups. There were 31 on one side and 30 on the other, 61 groups in total, containing 242 individual sign impressions. He counted the distinct signs, the number of different pictographic images that appeared across both faces of the disc. There were 45 unique symbols, stamped into clay in a spiral arrangement on both sides of a disc, found in the ruins of a palace that had been destroyed sometime around 1700 before the Common Era. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. Nothing like it has been seen since. That was over 100 years ago. In the century that has followed, the Phaistos disc has become the most famous, most studied, most debated, and most thoroughly undeciphered artifact in the history of archaeology. It has been the subject of over 50 published attempted decipherments. It has been claimed as Minoan, as Greek, as Anatolian, as Semitic, as a prayer, as a legal document, as a calendar, as a game board, as a piece of music, and as a forgery. Not one of these claims has achieved scholarly consensus. Not one has been confirmed by independent evidence. Not one has survived sustained peer review. The disc sits today in the Heraclean Archaeological Museum on Crete, in a glass case in a quiet corner, surrounded by the more conventionally impressive artifacts of the Minoan civilization, the frescoes, the pottery, the golden jewelry, the ritual vessels. It is small, it is unassuming, and it is, by any honest assessment, the single most mysterious object ever pulled from the earth by human hands. The numbers are striking: 45 distinct symbols, 242 sign impressions, 61 sign groups, one disc, one artifact. No other object bearing the same script has ever been found, not on Crete, not anywhere in the Mediterranean, not anywhere in the world. The Phaistos disc is unique. It is a writing system represented by exactly one document, a language represented by exactly one text, a tradition of manufacture represented by exactly one object. Every other undeciphered script in the world, Linear A, the Indus Valley script, Proto-Elamite, Rongo-Rongo, exists in multiple examples. Multiple inscriptions allow statistical analysis, pattern recognition, frequency counting, and structural comparison. Multiple inscriptions give the analyst a foothold. The Phaistos disc offers no foothold. There is one disc, and one disc alone, and that singularity is the root of everything that makes it impossible. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand what the Phaistos disc actually is, or, more precisely, what we know and do not know about it. You are going to learn about its discovery, its physical properties, the history of attempts to read it, and the reasons those attempts have failed. You are going to confront a possibility that many scholars now consider the most honest assessment available, that the Phaistos disc may be permanently undecipherable. Not because we lack the intelligence to decode it, but because a single short text, in an unknown script, recording an unknown language, with no parallel examples and no bilingual key, simply does not contain enough information to support decipherment. The disc is not a locked door waiting for a key. It is a single footprint in sand, evidence that someone walked here, but not enough evidence to determine who, or where they came from, or where they were going. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let us begin. The story of the Phaistos disc begins with the palace where it was found, and the civilization that built the palace. Phaistos was the second largest palace complex of the Minoan civilization, surpassed in size only by the Great Palace at Knossos, 50 kilometers to the north across the mountainous spine of central Crete. The palace stood on a low hill overlooking the Messara Plain, the largest and most fertile lowland on the island, with a commanding view south across the plain to the Libyan Sea and the mountains of the Asterousia Range. The site had been occupied for millennia before the palace was built. Neolithic pottery fragments found at Phaistos date back to at least the 5th millennium before the Common Era, and by the time of the disc's creation, the palace had already been built, destroyed, and rebuilt at least once. The palace that Pernier excavated, the so-called New Palace, dating to roughly 1700 to 1450 before the Common Era, was a sprawling complex of storerooms, workshops, ceremonial halls, and residential quarters built around a large central courtyard in the characteristic Minoan style. Like Knossos, it featured sophisticated drainage systems, plastered walls, and evidence of elaborate ritual activity. Unlike Knossos, which was partially reconstructed, some would say imaginatively reconstructed, by Arthur Evans in the early 20th century, Phaistos was left largely in its excavated state, its ruins open to the sky, its walls standing to their surviving height without modern additions. It is in many ways the more authentic of the two sites. A palace, as the archaeologists found it, not as a visionary Edwardian scholar thought it should have looked. The setting of the palace at Phaistos is itself significant for understanding the disc. Phaistos controlled the Messara Plain, the largest and most productive agricultural region on Crete. The palace was not merely a royal residence. It was an administrative centre, the hub of a complex economic system that managed the production, storage, and distribution of agricultural surplus across a wide territory. The storerooms of the palace held enormous quantities of grain, oil, wine, and other commodities, recorded on clay tablets inscribed in Linear A. The palace was, in modern terms, both a government building and a warehouse, a place where political authority and economic management were fused into a single institutional framework. This administrative function provides the most plausible context for the disc's presence in the palace. If the disc is an administrative document, a contract, a record, a certificate, its presence in a palace storeroom is natural and expected. The disc was found in a room associated with the palace's administrative wing, a room that also contained a Linear A tablet, the standard medium of Minoan palace administration. The co-presence of the disc and the tablet in the same room suggests that both served similar functions, that both were documents produced for administrative purposes, stored in an administrative context. But the palace at Phaistos was not only an administrative centre, it was also a religious centre. The great central courtyard, the defining architectural feature of every Minoan palace, is believed to have served as a ritual space, the setting for ceremonies, dances, and possibly the bull-leaping performances that are among the most iconic images of Minoan culture. The palace's western wing contained rooms that have been identified as shrines, based on the presence of ritual objects, libation tables, offering vessels, and figurines. If the disc is a religious object rather than an administrative one, its presence in the palace is equally explicable. It was stored in a building that served both secular and sacred functions. The ambiguity of the palace's dual function, administrative and religious, mirrors the ambiguity of the disc itself. Was the disc a record or a prayer, a contract or a hymn? The building offers no answer, because the building served both purposes. The room offers no answer, because the room contained both administrative and potentially ritual objects. The context illuminates the range of possibilities. It does not narrow them. The Italian archaeological mission to Crete, led by Federico Halber and later by Luigi Pernier, had been working at Phaistos since 1900. The excavation was methodical and productive, yielding a wealth of material that documented the development of the Minoan palace culture over several centuries. Clay tablets inscribed in Linear A, the undeciphered script of the Minoans, were found in the palace storerooms along with pottery, seal stones, metalwork, and the other standard artifacts of Minoan material culture. The discovery of the disc, while dramatic, was part of a broader excavation campaign that was producing significant results across multiple fronts. Pernier's account of the discovery deserves careful attention because it is the only primary source for the disk's archaeological context, and because it has been the subject of intense scrutiny by both supporters and skeptics of the disk's authenticity. Pernier recorded that the disk was found in room 8 of a building he designated as the palace dependencies, a complex of rooms adjacent to the main palace building, probably serving as administrative or storage space. The room also contained a Linear A tablet, pottery fragments, and ash deposits consistent with the destruction layer that marks the end of the Middle Minoan palace period. Pernier interpreted the disk as a contemporary of the other objects in the room, an artifact from the Middle Minoan period dating to roughly 1800 to 1700 before the Common Era. The problem with Pernier's account is not that it is inaccurate, but that it is insufficiently detailed by modern standards. He did not record the precise stratigraphic position of the disk within the room, whether it were found on the floor, in a collapsed wall, or within a fill deposit. He did not record the spatial relationship between the disk and the other objects in the room, whether they were found in close proximity or scattered across the room. He did not take photographs of the disk in situ, in its original position in the ground, before removing it. These omissions, which were common in excavation practice at the time, but which would be considered serious deficiencies today, mean that the disk's precise context cannot be reconstructed with confidence. The French archaeologist and epigrapher Louis Godard, who reviewed Pernier's excavation records in detail during his own study of the disk, concluded that the records, while imperfect, were consistent with a genuine Bronze Age find. Godard noted that the ash and destruction debris in room 8 were consistent with the catastrophic destruction of the palace, probably by earthquake and fire that occurred around 1700 before the Common Era, and that the disk's presence in this debris was consistent with its having been in the room when the destruction occurred. But Godard also acknowledged that the records did not exclude the possibility of a later intrusion, a more recent deposit mixed into the Bronze Age layer by natural or human action. But the disk was immediately recognized as different. Everything about it was anomalous. The script was not Linear A. The signs did not match any known Cretan writing system, not Crete hieroglyphic, not Linear A, not the later Linear B. The manufacturing technique, stamping with pre-made punches rather than incising with a stylus, was without precedent in the ancient Aegean. The spiral arrangement of the text was unlike any other known inscription format. The disk was, from the moment of its discovery, a puzzle within a puzzle, an object that did not fit any existing category, and that seemed to belong to a tradition of writing and manufacture that had left no other trace. Pernier published his discovery in 1908, providing a detailed description of the disk, its context, and its physical characteristics. His publication attracted immediate scholarly attention and inaugurated a debate that has continued without resolution for over a century. The disk was a sensation. It was photographed, cast in plaster, and distributed to scholars across Europe. Within a decade, the first attempted decipherments were published. Within 2 decades, the disk had become the most famous undeciphered artifact in the world, a position it has never relinquished. The physical properties of the disk are well documented and provide the foundation for all subsequent analysis. The disk is made of fine-grained clay, carefully prepared and smoothed before the signs were impressed. The clay has been fired to a high temperature, producing a hard, durable ceramic. The surface is in excellent condition. The signs are crisp, clear, and fully legible, with no significant damage or wear. Both faces of the disk bear inscriptions, and the signs on both faces were impressed by the same set of punches. The same 45 tools were used on both sides. This indicates that the disk was inscribed in a single session, or at least that the same craftsman using the same tools produced both faces. The signs themselves are small, each occupying a roughly square space of about 10 millimeters on a side. They are remarkably detailed for their size. Many are recognizable pictographic images: a walking human figure, a head wearing a plumed headdress, a bird, a fish, a flower, a ship, an animal skin, a tool or implement of uncertain function. Others are more abstract: geometric shapes, dots, lines, and combinations that do not correspond to any easily identifiable object. The pictographic quality of many signs suggests that the script may have originated as a true pictographic system, a system in which each sign depicts the thing it represents, but the presence of abstract signs suggests that the system had evolved beyond pure pictography into something more complex. The stamping technique is one of the most significant and most debated features of the disc. Each sign was impressed into the wet clay by a separate punch, a small tool probably made of wood, bone, or metal, into which the sign had been carved in reverse. The craftsman pressed each punch into the clay to create the impression, then moved to the next sign and pressed the next punch. The process is, in conceptual terms, identical to printing. The same sign can be reproduced any number of times using the same punch, producing identical impressions each time. The Phaistos disc is, in a sense, the world's first printed document, a text produced not by the free movement of a stylus or pen, but by the repetitive application of pre-made type. The implications of this observation ripple outward in several directions. The technique of stamping signs with pre-made punches is fundamentally different from the technique of incising signs with a stylus. Incision is a subtractive process. The scribe removes material from the surface of the clay to create the sign. Stamping is an additive process. The scribe presses a three-dimensional form into the surface, displacing the clay to create the impression. The two processes require different tools, different skills, and different workflows. A scribe who is trained to incise linear signs with a pointed stylus cannot simply pick up a set of punches and begin stamping Phaistos disc signs without additional training. The two techniques represent different scribal traditions, and the existence of a stamping tradition on Crete, where every other known script was incised, implies the existence of a distinct community of practitioners who were trained in stamping rather than incision. Where was this community? When did it develop? How long did it persist? How many documents did it produce? These are questions that the disc itself cannot answer and that no other archaeological evidence has illuminated. The stamping community, if it existed, is as invisible as the disc's language. The only trace of its existence is the disc itself and the 45 punches that produced it. Those punches, which would constitute the most important physical evidence of the stamping tradition, have never been found. They may have been made of wood or bone and have long since decayed. They may have been made of metal and have been melted down for reuse. They may be sitting undiscovered in the soil of Phaistos or of some other site. Their absence is one of the disc's many silences, a silence that is particularly frustrating because the punches, if found, could answer several critical questions at once. Their material composition would indicate the level of metallurgical or craft skill available to the disc's creators. Their wear patterns would indicate how many impressions they had been used to make, and therefore how many other documents the tradition produced. Their find spot would indicate the geographical origin of the tradition. Every one of these questions is currently unanswerable. The punches are the key to the disc, and the key is lost. The observation about the cost of creating the punch set is worth restating in starker terms. Each of the 45 punches was an individually crafted tool, a small object into which a specific pictographic sign had been carved in reverse, with sufficient precision and depth to produce a clear impression when pressed into clay. Creating such a punch would have required considerable skill and time. Each sign had to be carved in mirror image at a scale of roughly 10 millimeters, with enough detail to be clearly identifiable in the impression. The total labor involved in creating the full set of 45 punches would have been substantial. Many hours or even days of skilled craft work, depending on the material and the craftsman's expertise. This investment only makes sense if the punches were intended for repeated use. A scribe does not create a set of movable type to produce a single document. The type is the investment. The documents are the return. The existence of the punches implies the existence of a production run. Multiple documents produced over time using the same set of type. The disc is presumably one document from this production run. Where are the others? The answer, that they have not been found, is either a gap in the archaeological record or evidence that the production run was very small perhaps limited to the disk alone. If the former, future excavations might yet produce additional examples. If the latter, the disk is even more anomalous than it already appears, a product of a unique technology applied exactly once. This observation has generated considerable discussion. If the disk was produced using movable type, then the type must have been created for a purpose, and the purpose was presumably to produce more than one disk. A set of 45 punches represents a significant investment of time and skill. No craftsman would create such a set to produce a single document. The existence of the punches implies the existence of other documents, other disks, or perhaps other inscribed surfaces that were produced using the same type. Where are they? They have never been found. Not a single other object bearing impressions from the same set of punches has been discovered anywhere in the world. This absence is one of the disk's deepest mysteries. Either the other documents produced by the same type have been lost, destroyed, eroded, or not yet excavated, or the type was used only once. If the former, then the disk is a survivor of a broader tradition of stamp-based writing that has otherwise perished. If the latter, then the investment in creating 45 individual punches for a single use is puzzling, a level of effort that seems disproportionate to the result. There is a third possibility, and it is the one that many scholars find most troubling, that the disk is a forgery. The forgery hypothesis, first raised in the 1970s and given its most detailed articulation by the scholar Jerome Eisenberg in 2008, argues that the disk was produced not in the Bronze Age but in the early 20th century, by someone with knowledge of Minoan art and script, who created the disk and planted it at the Phaistos excavation site for Pernier to find. The argument for forgery rests on several observations. First, the disk's discovery context is poorly documented by modern standards. Pernier's excavation records for the specific room in which the disk was found are sparse, far sparser than would be acceptable in a modern excavation. The stratigraphy, the layering of deposits that allows archaeologists to determine the date and context of a find, was not recorded with the precision that would allow the disk's age to be independently verified from its burial context. Second, the disk is unique. No other object like it has ever been found, and unique objects, by their nature, cannot be verified by comparison with parallels. Third, the disk's signs, while superficially consistent with Minoan or Aegean art, do not precisely match any known Minoan sign inventory. Some of the signs, particularly the plumed head, which has been compared to images of Philistine or other Eastern Mediterranean warriors, suggest connections to non-Minoan traditions that might reflect the knowledge of a sophisticated forger rather than the output of a genuine Minoan workshop. The forgery hypothesis has not been widely accepted. The majority of scholars who have examined the disk accept it as a genuine ancient artifact based on the physical characteristics of the clay, the firing, and the patina of age on its surface. But the hypothesis has also not been definitively refuted. Unlike many other ancient artifacts of disputed authenticity, the disk has never been subjected to thermoluminescence dating, a technique that can determine when clay was last fired, and that would provide definitive evidence of age. The reason for this omission is that thermoluminescence dating requires the destruction of a small sample of the object, and the Greek archaeological authorities have not authorized destructive testing of the disk. Until such testing is performed, the question of authenticity remains, in the strict scientific sense, open. This uncertainty casts a shadow over every subsequent discussion. If the disk is a forgery, then the entire century of decipherment effort has been directed at a modern fabrication, a puzzle with no solution because it was designed to have no solution. If the disk is genuine, then its decipherment remains a legitimate scholarly goal, but a goal that faces obstacles so severe that many scholars now regard it as unattainable. The archaeological context of the disk, such as it is, places it in a deposit associated with the Middle Minoan period, roughly the first half of the second millennium before the Common Era, and contemporary with the height of the Minoan palace culture. The room in which it was found, room 8 of a building adjacent to the main palace complex, also contained a Linear A tablet and a number of other artifacts consistent with a Middle Minoan date. The co-occurrence of the disk and the Linear A tablet in the same room raises the question of the relationship between the two writing systems. Were they contemporary? Were they used by the same people? Did the disc arrive at Phaistos from elsewhere, imported from another culture that used a different script? Or was the disc produced locally by a Minoan craftsman working in a tradition that was separate from the Linear A scribal tradition? These questions cannot be answered. The disc provides no context for itself. It does not say where it came from. It does not say who made it. It does not say what it is for. It is an object stripped of every connection to the world that produced it, floating free in time and space, tethered to reality only by the soil in which it was found, and the palace whose ruins surrounded it. The Minoan civilization, as discussed in previous explorations, is itself poorly understood. A civilization whose writing, Linear A, cannot be read, whose language is unknown, and whose inner life is accessible only through material remains. The disc exists within this already opaque context as an additional layer of opacity, a mystery within a mystery, an undeciphered text embedded in an undeciphered culture. If we could read Linear A, we might be able to determine the relationship between the disc script and the Minoan writing system. If we knew the Minoan language, we might be able to identify the language of the disc. But we can do neither. The disc script is unknown. Its language is unknown. The culture in which it was found is itself largely unknown. The context that might illuminate the object is as dark as the object itself. The scholar Louis Godard, who has written one of the most comprehensive studies of the disc, a monograph titled The Phaistos Disc, The Enigma of an Aegean Script, published in 1995, summarized the situation with a candor that is rare in academic publishing. The Phaistos disc, Godard wrote, is an isolated find. It cannot be compared with anything. It exists in a void, and in a void, all interpretations are equally plausible and equally unprovable. Godard's assessment has not been significantly revised in the 3 decades since it was written. The disc remains isolated, the void remains unfilled, and the interpretations continue to multiply, each one more creative and less convincing than the last. To grasp the full weight of the disc's isolation, it helps to understand what a normal archaeological find looks like. When archaeologists discover an inscribed object at a site, a clay tablet, a seal stone, a piece of pottery with scratched marks, they do not study it alone. They study it in the context of hundreds or thousands of similar objects from the same site and from contemporary sites across the region. They compare the script to other examples of the same script. They compare the language to other documents in the same language. They compare the object type to other objects of the same type. Every inscribed artifact is a node in a network of related artifacts, and the network provides the context that makes interpretation possible. The Phaistos disc has no network. It is a node without connections, a single point in a space that should be populated by dozens or hundreds of related objects, but that is, in fact, empty. The isolation is so complete that it raises the question of whether the disc belongs to the Minoan world at all. Some scholars have suggested that the disc is an import, an object brought to Crete from another culture, perhaps from Anatolia, the Levant, or the Aegean Islands. If the disc was produced outside Crete, its script might not be Minoan at all. It might represent a writing system used by a different culture, a culture that has left no other written trace in the archaeological record. This hypothesis explains the disc's uniqueness but replaces one mystery with another. Which culture? Where? And why is there no other evidence of its writing? The archaeologist Yves Duhoux, who has written extensively on both Linear A and the Phaistos disc, has explored the question of the disc's origin in detail. Duhoux notes that the clay from which the disc was made has not been conclusively sourced. No petrographic or chemical analysis has definitively linked the clay to a specific geological region. If the clay could be shown to come from a specific location, Crete, Anatolia, or elsewhere, it would provide a critical constraint on the disc's origin. But this analysis has not been performed with sufficient resolution, and the disc's provenance remains, like everything else about it, uncertain. The question of where the disc was made is inseparable from the question of what the disc is for. If it is a local Cretan product, it might be a religious object, an administrative document, or a record of some kind produced for use within the Minoan palace system. If it is an import, it might be a diplomatic gift, a trade document, or a curiosity acquired by a Minoan official or priest. Each interpretation carries different implications for the language of the text, the meaning of the signs, and the purpose of the artifact. And each interpretation is equally unverifiable, because the disc itself provides no evidence to distinguish between them. The spiral format of the inscription adds another layer of complexity to the question of purpose. Spiral inscriptions are rare in the ancient world, but not unknown. The most commonly cited parallel is the spiral text found on certain Mesopotamian clay cones. Small cone-shaped objects inscribed with royal dedicatory texts that spiral around the surface from top to bottom. But the Mesopotamian cones are quite different from the Phaistos disc in both form and function, and the parallel is superficial at best. More suggestive is the observation that spiral patterns are common in Minoan decorative art. They appear on pottery, on frescoes, on seal stones, and on ritual objects of various kinds. The spiral was clearly a meaningful motif in Minoan culture, but a decorative spiral is not the same as a textual spiral, and the disc's combination of spiral form with stamped text remains without any close parallel. One further aspect of the disc's physical properties deserves mention, because it has implications for the question of authenticity. The surface of the disc shows a fine network of hairline cracks, a craquelure pattern that is characteristic of aged ceramics, and that is extremely difficult to fake convincingly. The craquelure on the disc is consistent with natural aging over centuries, the slow expansion and contraction of the clay in response to temperature and humidity changes. This feature has been cited by supporters of the disc's authenticity as strong evidence against forgery. A forger working in the early 20th century could produce a disc of the right shape, size, and material, producing a craquelure pattern consistent with 3,500 years of aging would be far more difficult. But the defenders of the forgery hypothesis have countered that craquelure can be artificially induced by rapid heating and cooling, by chemical treatment, or by other techniques known to art forgers. The argument has become circular. The disc's supporters point to physical features that are consistent with age, while the disc's detractors point to the possibility that those features could be faked. Without thermoluminescence dating, the circle cannot be broken. The shadow of the forgery hypothesis hangs over every discussion of the disc, not because most scholars believe it is a fake, but because the possibility cannot be excluded. In a field where certainty is already scarce, this additional uncertainty compounds every other uncertainty, making every conclusion provisional and every interpretation conditional. If the disc is genuine, its decipherment is an important scholarly goal. If it is a forgery, its decipherment is a wild goose chase. And until the disc's authenticity is established beyond reasonable doubt, every scholar who works on it does so under the shadow of this unresolvable question. The disc also exists within a broader context of Aegean undecipherment that magnifies its obscurity. The Minoans produced three distinct writing systems: Cretan hieroglyphic, Linear A, and the script of the Phaistos disc, if it is indeed a separate system. Of these three, none has been deciphered. The later Linear B, used by the Mycenaean Greeks, who succeeded the Minoans on Crete, was deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952, a triumph that revealed Linear B to be an early form of Greek, but the Minoan scripts remain opaque. The Minoans spoke a language that was not Greek, that has no known descendants, and that may be a linguistic isolate, a language with no relatives in any known language family. This linguistic isolation affects the Phaistos disc directly, even if the disc's script could be transliterated. Even if sound values could be assigned to its signs, the resulting words would be in a language that no one understands. The situation is analogous to what we have seen with Linear A, but worse. Linear A has a corpus of roughly 1,500 inscriptions. The Phaistos disc has a corpus of 1. Linear A shares many signs with the deciphered Linear B, providing a partial key to its sound values. The Phaistos disc shares no signs with any deciphered script. Linear A is known to be Minoan. The Phaistos disc might not be. At every level, corpus size, sign parallels, linguistic identification, cultural context, The disk is at a greater disadvantage than the already intractable linear A. The epigrapher Thomas Palaima has described the disk as the hardest problem in Aegean epigraphy, a statement that carries particular weight given that Aegean epigraphy is, by the standards of the field, already the hardest branch of the discipline. The disk is the extreme case, the outermost point on the spectrum of undecipherability, the problem that represents the absolute limit of what scholarship can address with the evidence available. And yet the disk continues to attract decipherers. The very impossibility of the problem seems to enhance its appeal. The Phaistos disk is the Everest of epigraphy, a challenge that defeats everyone who attempts it, but that no one can resist attempting. The mountain is unclimbable. The climbers keep coming, and the disk sits in its case in Heraklion as it has sat for over a century, waiting for the climber who will finally reach the summit, or, more likely, enduring as the monument to the summit that cannot be reached. The core problem of the Phaistos disk is not complexity, it is simplicity. The disk is too simple, too short, too isolated, too devoid of context to support any analytical method that has ever been successfully applied to an undeciphered script. This is a counterintuitive statement. The disk looks complex. Its spiral arrangement, its stamped symbols, its mysterious pictographs all suggest a rich and intricate system. But complexity of appearance is not the same as complexity of data. The data on the Phaistos disk consists of 242 sign impressions, organized into 61 groups, using 45 distinct signs. For comparison, the corpus of Linear A contains approximately 7,700 sign impressions using 77 distinct syllabic signs. The corpus of the Indus Valley script contains approximately 26,000 sign impressions using roughly 400 distinct signs. The Rosetta Stone alone contains over 1,700 hieroglyphic signs. Even the Voynich manuscript, that most intractable of puzzles, contains approximately 170,000 characters. The Phaistos disk contains 242 signs. That is less than a single page of most books. It is less than a long paragraph. It is, in terms of the information it provides to an analyst, almost nothing. The consequences of this brevity are devastating and specific. Consider the standard methods of cryptanalysis and linguistic analysis, and observe how each one fails when applied to the disk. Frequency analysis. The counting of individual sign occurrences to determine which signs are most and least common requires a sample large enough for the frequencies to stabilize. In a very short text, the frequencies are dominated by random variation. A sign that appears 3 times in a 242 sign text might be the most common sign in the language, or an uncommon sign that happens, by chance, to appear 3 times in this particular text. The sample is too small to tell. The most common sign on the disk appears 19 times. The least common signs appear only once. In a corpus of this size, these frequencies are essentially meaningless. They could represent almost any underlying frequency distribution, and no firm conclusions can be drawn from them. Sequence analysis, the study of which signs tend to follow which other signs, which is the foundation of most modern decipherment techniques, requires enough text to establish statistically significant patterns. A sign that follows another sign twice in a 242 sign text might represent a genuine linguistic pattern or a coincidence. The sample is too small to distinguish between the two. The total number of sign pair occurrences on the disk is far below the threshold required for meaningful sequential analysis. Structural analysis, the identification of word boundaries, grammatical patterns, and syntactic structures requires text long enough and varied enough to reveal the internal organization of the language. The disk contains 61 sign groups, most of which are quite short, 2 to 7 signs each. These groups, if they represent words or phrases, are too few and too brief to reveal grammatical patterns. You cannot identify verb conjugations from 61 examples. You cannot reconstruct noun declensions from 242 signs. The text is a single, short sample, the equivalent of a single sentence, or at most a short paragraph, and a single sentence does not reveal the grammar of a language. Comparative analysis, the comparison of the disk's signs with signs from other known scripts, requires parallels, and the disk has none. Its signs do not match the signs of Linear A. They do not match Cretan hieroglyphic. They do not match any known Anatolian, Egyptian, Semitic, or Cypriot script. A few superficial resemblances have been noted. The walking human figure, for example, bears a general likeness to certain Egyptian hieroglyphs, but these resemblances are too vague and too common to support identification. Human figures appear in virtually every pictographic script in the world. A walking man on the Phaistos disc does not necessarily have any connection to a walking man in Egyptian hieroglyphs. Bilingual comparison, the gold standard of decipherment, in which an unknown text is compared with a known translation of the same content, is impossible for the disc. No bilingual inscription exists. No parallel text in any known language has been identified. The disc exists in complete linguistic isolation. The result of these collective failures is that the Phaistos disc occupies a unique position among the world's undeciphered texts. It is the only one for which no analytical method currently exists that could, even in principle, lead to decipherment on the basis of the available evidence. Linear A could be deciphered if a bilingual text were found, or if the language were identified. The Indus script could yield to internal analysis if enough long texts were discovered. The Voynich manuscript could be cracked if the cipher were identified or the language recognized. The Phaistos disc cannot be deciphered by any known method because the amount of data it provides is below the minimum threshold for every applicable technique. The linguist and epigrapher John Younger of the University of Kansas, one of the leading specialists on Aegean scripts, has stated the problem with characteristic directness. The Phaistos disc, Younger has written, is undecipherable, not undeciphered. Undecipherable. There is not enough text on the disc to support any decipherment, regardless of the method used. Any proposed reading is, by definition, unverifiable, because there is no independent evidence against which to check it. You can propose any language, any reading system, and any translation, and no one can prove you wrong, which means no one can prove you right. The disc is, in the strictest sense, beyond the reach of scholarship. This assessment, which is shared by the majority of specialists in Aegean scripts, has not deterred the production of proposed decipherments. On the contrary, the disc's very undecipherability seems to attract would-be decipherers, like a flame attracts moths. The absence of verifiability, which should discourage serious scholars, instead emboldens them, because a proposed reading that cannot be disproven feels, to its author, like a reading that has been confirmed. The psychological dynamic is insidious. The less evidence there is to constrain a reading, the easier it is to produce a reading that is internally consistent, and the more convincing the reading appears to its creator. The disc has generated more proposed decipherments per unit of text than any other artifact in history, a ratio that is inversely proportional to the probability that any of them is correct. But here is the problem. The undecipherability of the disc is not the only problem. There is a deeper issue, one that calls into question the very nature of the disc as an object. The 45 signs of the Phaistos disc are a large number for an alphabet. Most alphabets have between 20 and 35 signs. They are a small number for a syllabary. Most syllabaries have between 40 and 90 signs. They are far too few for a logographic system. Chinese, for example, requires several thousand characters. The number 45 sits in an awkward middle ground between writing system types. It could represent an alphabet with some additional signs, ligatures, determinatives, or logograms, mixed in with the phonetic characters. It could represent a small syllabary of the type used to write languages with simple syllable structures. It could represent something else entirely, a system that does not fit neatly into any standard typological category. The individual signs have been studied in extraordinary detail, and several have become focal points for broader interpretive debates. The most famous sign, designated as sign number 2 in most cataloguing systems, depicts a human head wearing a tall feathered headdress. This sign has been compared to depictions of Philistine warriors found in Egyptian temple reliefs dating to the reign of Ramesses III, roughly 1200 before the Common Era. The similarity is striking. Both the disc sign and the Egyptian depictions show a profile head with a distinctive upward sweeping arrangement of feathers or plumes. Some scholars have used this comparison to argue that the disc has a connection to the Sea Peoples, the mysterious confederation of maritime raiders who attacked Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age. Others have argued that the comparison is superficial, that feathered headdresses are found in many ancient cultures, and that the resemblance does not prove a historical connection. The plumed head sign is the most frequently occurring sign on the disc. It appears 19 times, far more than any other sign. If it is a phonetic sign, its high frequency suggests that it represents a common sound in the language, a vowel, perhaps, or a high-frequency consonant like N or T. If it is a logographic sign, representing a whole word rather than a sound, its frequency suggests that the word it represents is repeated many times in the text, which might indicate a refrain, a title, or a key concept. The sign's frequency is one of the very few statistical features of the disc that can be discussed with any confidence, but even this feature is ambiguous. It supports multiple interpretations and constrains none. Other distinctive signs include a walking human figure, which appears 7 times, a woman, which appears 4 times, a ship, which appears 3 times, a shield, which appears twice, and a cat or panther, which appears once. The pictographic character of these signs invites interpretation. It is tempting to see the ship as representing sea travel, the shield as representing warfare, the woman as representing a goddess. But pictographic interpretation is treacherous. In Egyptian hieroglyphs, the sign depicting an owl represents not an owl but the sound M. In Mayan glyphs, the sign depicting a jaguar head represents not a jaguar but a day name. The relationship between a sign's pictographic appearance and its linguistic function is, in all known writing systems, arbitrary and unpredictable. What a sign looks like tells you nothing about what it sounds like or what it means. The ambiguity of the sign count is compounded by the ambiguity of the sign groups. The 61 groups on the disc, separated by incised vertical lines, could represent words, phrases, sentences, or something else. If they represent words, then the disc contains a vocabulary of roughly 61 words, a very small sample, but possibly enough to identify a few structural patterns. If they represent phrases or sentences, then the vocabulary is smaller still, each group containing multiple words that cannot be individually delimited. Without knowing how the groups relate to linguistic units, no structural analysis is possible, and it gets worse. The spiral arrangement of the text, which is one of the disc's most visually distinctive features, presents an additional problem: the direction of reading. The text spirals from the outside edge toward the center on both faces of the disc. But does it read from the outside in or from the center out? The question is not trivial. The direction of reading determines the order of the signs, and the order determines which signs begin sign groups and which signs end them. A sign that appears at the beginning of a group in one reading direction appears at the end in the other. Since the position of signs within groups is one of the very few structural features available for analysis, getting the direction wrong would invalidate every positional observation. The evidence for the reading direction is inconclusive. Some scholars have argued for an outside-in reading based on the observation that the impressions on the outer edge appear to have been stamped first. The signs near the center are slightly more crowded, suggesting that the craftsman was running out of space as he worked inward. This observation, first made by Evans and confirmed by subsequent study, is the strongest evidence for any reading direction. The logic is straightforward. If the craftsman began at the outside edge and worked inward, then the outside edge is the beginning of the text, and the disc should be read from outside to center. Others have argued for a center-out reading, based on parallels with other spiral texts in the ancient world, and on the aesthetic observation that spiral patterns in Minoan art typically develop outward from a central point. This argument is weaker. Aesthetic parallels are not the same as scribal conventions, but it cannot be ruled out. A few scholars have even proposed that the reading direction alternates, that the text on one face reads from outside to center, while the text on the other face reads from center to outside, creating a boustrophedon-like pattern at the level of the whole disc rather than at the level of individual lines. The question has not been resolved, and both reading directions continue to be used in proposed decipherments, a fact that further illustrates the underdetermination of the evidence. Two different scholars using two different reading directions will produce two completely different analyses of the sign group structure. Different initial signs, different final signs, different sequential patterns. Both analyses will appear internally consistent. Neither can be verified against independent evidence. The reading direction is, like everything else about the disk, a matter of assumption rather than knowledge. There is also a structural feature of the disk that has attracted particular attention from scholars: the presence of a small oblique stroke that appears to the lower left of certain signs, seemingly marking them as distinct from unmarked signs of the same type. This stroke, which some scholars call a diacritical mark and others call a modifier, appears on approximately 18 of the 242 sign impressions. Its function is unknown. It might indicate a phonetic modification, a different pronunciation of the same basic sign, similar to the way an accent mark modifies a vowel in French. It might indicate a grammatical function, marking a sign as belonging to a specific morphological category. It might be a scribal convention with no linguistic significance at all. The mark is consistent. It always appears in the same position relative to the sign it modifies, which suggests that it is meaningful rather than accidental. But its meaning is, like everything else on the disk, beyond recovery. The disk's uniqueness is itself the most fundamental obstacle of all. Every successful decipherment in the history of epigraphy has relied on comparison, on the ability to compare the unknown text with other texts, whether in the same script, in a related script, or in a known language. Comparison requires parallels. The Phaistos disk has no parallels. There is nothing to compare it to. It is an island, a single artifact, floating alone in an ocean of ignorance, with no bridge connecting it to any known linguistic or epigraphic tradition. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The disk was stamped. The existence of 45 individual punches implies the existence of a manufacturing tradition, a workshop or a craftsman who created the punches, who presumably used them to produce other documents, and who operated within a cultural context that valued and used this particular form of writing. That tradition is invisible. Not a single other trace of it has been found. The punches themselves have never been discovered. No other stamped inscription from the Bronze Age Aegean has been identified. The disk's manufacturing technique, which implies a tradition, which implies other products, which implies a context, is a ghost. The evidence of its existence is the disk itself, and the disk, standing alone, is insufficient to reconstruct the tradition that produced it. The absence of parallels is not just an inconvenience, it is a categorical problem. It means that the disk cannot be studied as a specimen of a type. It can only be studied as a unique object, an object whose every feature must be interpreted in isolation, without reference to any external standard. In science, a single unreplicated observation is considered anecdotal, insufficient to support a conclusion. The Phaistos disk is the archaeological equivalent of an anecdotal observation, a single data point from which no generalizations can be drawn, no patterns can be established, and no hypotheses can be tested. And yet the disk is real. It was made by someone for some purpose in some language using some script. The 45 signs mean something, or they meant something once, to the person who carved the punches and the person who read the text. That meaning is locked in the clay, preserved for over 3,500 years, as clear and as legible as the day it was stamped. The signs are not damaged. The disk is not fragmentary. The data is complete. The problem is not that we lack the text. It is that we lack everything else: the language, the script, the context, the parallels, and the analytical framework that would allow us to transform 242 stamped symbols into 242 meaningful signs. We have the footprint. We do not have the foot. And a footprint, however clear, however perfectly preserved, cannot tell you the name of the person who made it. The parade of proposed decipherments illustrates the problem with devastating clarity. In 1975, the scholar Jean Fauconneau published a decipherment arguing that the disk recorded a text in Proto-Ionic Greek, an early form of the Greek language predating the classical period. His readings produced sentences that, he argued, described the dedication of a religious offering. The readings were detailed and internally consistent. They were also entirely dependent on a chain of assumptions about the sound values of the signs, the identity of the language, and the grammatical structure of Proto-Ionic that could not be independently verified. Other specialists in Greek philology found his readings unconvincing, noting that the Proto-Ionic forms he reconstructed were speculative and that his sign identifications were arbitrary. In 1984, the linguist Stephen Fisher proposed that the disc recorded a text in a Semitic language, specifically a form of early Greek influenced by Near Eastern linguistic structures. Fisher's reading produced a text that he interpreted as a hymn to a Minoan goddess. His proposal attracted media attention but was rejected by specialists who found his methodology circular. He assumed the language in order to produce the reading, and then cited the reading as evidence for the language. In 2014, the scholar Gareth Owens of the Technological Educational Institute of Crete announced that he had partially deciphered the disc, identifying it as a prayer to a Minoan mother goddess. Owens's reading was based on the assumption that some of the disc's signs had the same or similar sound values as signs in Linear A and Linear B, a reasonable hypothesis, but one that cannot be confirmed for a script of unknown affiliation. Owens produced readings of several sign groups that he interpreted as divine names and religious formulae. His work received extensive media coverage and some scholarly interest, but it has not been confirmed by other specialists and remains, like all previous proposed decipherments, in the category of plausible but unproven. The pattern is consistent and instructive. Each decipherer identifies a language: Greek, Semitic, Anatolian, Minoan. Each assigns sound values to the signs, values that are consistent with the chosen language, but that cannot be independently verified. Each produces readings that make sense within the framework of the chosen language and the assumed sound values. And each reading is rejected by the broader scholarly community because the assumptions on which it rests cannot be tested against independent evidence. The disc is an inkblot test for linguists. Each scholar sees in it what their training and interests predispose them to see. The disc confirms nothing and refutes nothing. It reflects the analyst, not the artifact. The mathematician and information theorist Claude Shannon would have recognized the problem immediately. Shannon's fundamental theorem of communications establishes that the amount of information that can be extracted from a message is limited by the amount of redundancy the message contains. Redundancy, the repetition and predictability that characterizes natural language, is what allows a codebreaker to gain traction. A message with high redundancy is easier to decode because the repeated patterns provide multiple opportunities to test and verify hypotheses. A message with low redundancy, or a message that is too short for its redundancy to be measured, is harder to decode, and below a certain threshold, decoding becomes impossible regardless of the method used. The Phaistos disk falls below this threshold. 242 signs do not contain enough redundancy to constrain the space of possible interpretations to a manageable size. The number of possible readings, given 45 unknown sign values, an unknown language, and an unknown writing system type, is astronomically large. Each proposed decipherment selects one reading from this astronomical space. The probability that any randomly selected reading is correct is vanishingly small, and since no independent evidence exists to distinguish correct readings from incorrect ones, the astronomical space remains unreduced. Every reading is equally plausible. No reading is confirmed. This is the mathematical reality behind the disk's undecipherability. It is not a matter of cleverness or dedication. It is a matter of information theory. The disk does not contain enough data to support decipherment. Adding more data, finding another disk, finding a bilingual inscription, finding a related script, would change the calculation fundamentally. But without additional data, the calculation is fixed, and the answer is zero. Zero confirmed readings, zero identified languages, zero decoded messages. The advent of computer-based analysis has not changed this fundamental reality. In the age of machine learning and artificial intelligence, the Phaistos disk might seem like a natural candidate for computational decipherment. Several teams have applied computational methods to the disk: statistical pattern analysis, entropy calculations, neural network classification, and the results have been consistent. The disk does not contain enough data for any computational method to produce reliable results. An artificial intelligence trained on thousands of inscriptions in known scripts can learn to recognize the statistical signatures of different writing systems. But when applied to the disk's 242 signs, the algorithms produce confidence intervals so wide that they encompass virtually every known writing system type. The machine, like the human scholar, cannot distinguish between possibilities when the data is too sparse. The computer scientist Kevin Knight, who has worked on computational approaches to undeciphered scripts, including the Voynich manuscript and the Copielli cipher, has described the Phaistos disk as a problem that is below the computational threshold of any known algorithm. Knight's assessment is not about the power of the algorithms. Modern algorithms are extraordinarily powerful. It is about the information content of the data. No algorithm, however sophisticated, can extract information that does not exist in the data. The disk's 242 signs do not contain enough information to constrain the space of possible solutions to a manageable size. The algorithm that could decipher the Phaistos disk from its current data alone has not been invented, and, according to information theory, cannot be invented because the problem is not computational but informational. This is a conclusion of profound importance, and it deserves to be stated without qualification. The Phaistos disk cannot be deciphered from its existing data alone. No method currently known to science, statistical, computational, linguistic, or cryptographic, can produce a verified reading from a corpus of 242 signs in an unknown script recording an unknown language. The problem is not a challenge waiting for a clever mind. It is a mathematical impossibility, an information theoretic barrier that cannot be overcome by effort, intelligence, or technology. The only way to decipher the disk is to find more data, another disk, a bilingual inscription, a related script, or some other external evidence that provides the missing information. Without that evidence, the disk is sealed. The disk sits in its case. The signs spiral inward. The meaning, if it exists, spirals with them, inward and inward and inward, toward a center that no one has reached and that may not contain what anyone expects. Despite the mathematical impossibility of verified decipherment from the disk's existing data, scholars have not stopped trying. The disk exerts a gravitational pull on the intellectual imagination that defies the cold logic of information theory. Each generation brings new methods, new comparisons, and new hypotheses. Each generation fails. But the failures are not uniform, they are instructive, and each one reveals a different dimension of the disk's mystery. What follows are 5 investigations into the Phaistos disk, each approaching the problem from a different angle and each arriving, by a different route, at the same conclusion. The disk does not yield. The first investigation is the comparative approach, the attempt to identify the disk's signs by matching them to signs in other known scripts. The logic of the comparative approach is straightforward. If the disk's signs can be matched to signs in a known script, if the walking man on the disk can be identified as the same sign as a walking man in Egyptian hieroglyphs, or Linear A, or Hittite Luwian, then the known sign values can be applied to the disk, and the text can be transliterated. This approach has been the most popular and the most prolific, generating dozens of proposed sign identifications over the past century. The most common comparisons have been with other Aegean scripts: Cretan hieroglyphic, Linear A, and Linear B. Several of the disk signs bear general resemblances to signs in these scripts. The walking man, the ship, the animal skin, and the shield all have rough counterparts in the Cretan hieroglyphic sign inventory. But the resemblances are general, not specific. The walking man on the disk is not identical to the walking man in Cretan hieroglyphic. The posture is different, the proportions are different, and the level of detail is different. The comparison depends on a judgment of similarity that is inherently subjective. How similar is similar enough? The scholar Gareth Owens, who has proposed some of the most detailed comparative identifications, argues that the similarities are close enough to justify assigning Linear A and Linear B sound values to corresponding disk signs. Using this approach, Owens has produced transliterations of several sign groups that he interprets as Minoan words, including what he claims are the names of Minoan deities. But the identifications rest on a chain of assumptions that the disk's script is related to the other Aegean scripts, that visual similarity implies phonetic equivalence, and that the language of the disk is the same as the language of Linear A. Each assumption is debatable, and the cumulative uncertainty makes the final readings highly provisional. Comparisons with non-Aegean scripts have been even less convincing. The plumed head sign has been compared to Philistine warrior depictions in Egyptian reliefs, but the Philistine connection would place the disk several centuries later than its archaeological context suggests. Signs that vaguely resemble Egyptian hieroglyphs have been noted, but the resemblances are at the level of general pictographic categories, human figures, animals, plants, that are common to all pictographic scripts, and that do not imply historical connections. The comparative approach has produced no consensus identifications. Not a single sign on the disk can be matched to a sign in a known script with sufficient confidence to serve as a starting point for decipherment. The disk's signs are, visually, in a category of their own, similar enough to other Aegean signs to suggest a general cultural connection, but different enough to prevent specific identifications. The failure of the comparative approach raises a troubling possibility that most scholars are reluctant to state explicitly, that the disk script may have no relatives. Every successful script comparison in the history of epigraphy has worked because the scripts being compared are historically related. They descended from a common ancestor, or were adapted from one culture to another. Egyptian hieratic descended from hieroglyphics. Linear B descended from Linear A. The Cyrillic alphabet descended from the Greek alphabet. These historical relationships leave visible traces in the sign inventories of the descendant scripts. Shared forms, shared structures, shared organizational principles. The absence of such traces in comparisons between the Phaistos disk and other known scripts suggests that the disk's script may not descend from any known writing system. It may represent an independent invention, a script created from scratch by a community that was either unaware of or uninterested in the other writing systems in use in the contemporary Aegean. If the disk script is an independent invention, then comparative analysis is not merely difficult, it is fundamentally inapplicable. You cannot compare the disk to other scripts if the disk has no relationship to other scripts. The comparative approach assumes a connection that may not exist, and without a connection, the approach produces noise rather than signal, superficial resemblances that reflect common pictographic conventions rather than historical relationships. Day. The archaeologist and epigrapher Brent Davis, who has published detailed studies of the relationship between the Phaistos disk and other Aegean scripts, has concluded that the disk shows no systematic relationship to any known Aegean writing system. Davis's assessment is based on a sign-by-sign comparison that goes beyond visual resemblance, examines structural features, the number of signs, the frequency distribution, the combinatorial behavior, and that finds no significant correspondences. The disk script, in Davis's analysis, is genuinely unique, not a variant of a known system but something new. The second investigation is the structural approach, the attempt to identify patterns in the arrangement of signs within and across sign groups, without reference to the sign's phonetic or semantic values. The structural approach has produced some of the most reliable observations about the disk, precisely because it does not depend on unverifiable assumptions about the language or the sound values of the signs. Structural analysis examines the text as a system of relationships. Which signs appear together? Which signs appear in specific positions within groups? Which groups share common sign sequences? The most robust structural observation is that certain signs show strong positional preferences. The plumed head sign, for example, appears at the beginning of sign groups far more often than at the end, a pattern consistent with its functioning as an initial element of a word or phrase. The dotted shield sign shows a strong preference for the final position in sign groups, consistent with its functioning as a suffix or terminal element. These positional preferences are consistent across both faces of the disk, suggesting that they reflect genuine structural features of the script or the language rather than random variation. A closer look at the positional data reveals additional patterns. Of the 45 distinct signs on the disk, roughly a dozen show strong positional preferences, appearing predominantly at the beginning, middle, or end of sign groups. The remaining signs appear in multiple positions without a clear preference. This distribution is consistent with a writing system in which some signs function as grammatical markers, prefixes, suffixes, or determinatives, while others function as content signs that can appear in any position. The grammar-don't-saint distinction is a fundamental feature of most known writing systems, and its apparent presence on the disk is one of the strongest arguments for the linguistic interpretation of the text. The structural analyst Torsten Timm, working with computational methods in the 2010s, pushed the structural analysis further by examining not just individual signs, but sequences of signs across the entire disk. Timm identified what he called repeating sign sequences, pairs or triplets of signs that appear together in the same order in multiple sign groups across the disk. Timm found that several sign sequences recur with a frequency that is difficult to explain as coincidence. One particular pair of signs appears together in the same order in 5 different sign groups, a pattern that, in a text of this length, is statistically noteworthy. If these repeating sequences represent recurring words or morphemes, as they would in a natural language, then the disk's text has a degree of internal structure that is consistent with linguistic content. Timm also identified what he called sign group families, groups of sign groups that share the same core sequence of signs, but differ in their initial or final signs. This pattern is strikingly consistent with linguistic morphology, with words that share the same root, but carry different prefixes or suffixes indicating different grammatical functions. If the sign group families represent inflected forms of the same word, then the disk's text exhibits a level of grammatical complexity that is difficult to explain as an artifact of random or mechanical production. But the structural observations, however robust, cannot by themselves support decipherment. Knowing that a particular sign tends to appear at the beginning of groups tells you nothing about what the sign sounds like or what it means. Knowing that a particular pair of signs recurs tells you nothing about what the pair represents. Structural analysis can describe the text's internal organization. It cannot decode it. The structural approach has, however, produced one observation that is genuinely tantalizing. Several scholars, including the German mathematician Thomas Ballastier, have noted that the sign groups on the disk show a pattern that is consistent with a formulaic text, a text built from a limited set of recurring phrases or expressions, combined and recombined in different ways. Formulaic texts are common in the ancient world. Prayers, hymns, dedicatory inscriptions, and legal formulae all exhibit this kind of repetitive structure. If the disk's text is formulaic, then its relatively limited vocabulary and its repeating sign sequences are not anomalies. They are exactly what would be expected from a text of this type. Ballastier has specifically proposed that the disk may be a religious text, a prayer or hymn addressed to one or more deities, with the repeating sign sequences representing refrains or invocations. This interpretation fits the structural evidence. Formulaic religious texts typically feature repetition, a limited vocabulary of key terms, and a regular rhythmic structure. It also fits the archaeological context. The disk was found in a palace complex where religious activity was clearly practiced alongside objects of ritual significance, but the interpretation cannot be confirmed because the content of the formulae, the actual words of the prayer, if it is a prayer, cannot be read. The structural approach has also revealed something about the relationship between the two faces of the disk. The sign group structure on face A is slightly different from the structure on face B. Face A has 31 groups, face B has 30. The average group length is slightly different. Roughly 4.2 signs per group on face A versus roughly 3.9 signs per group on face B. Some signs that are common on one face are rare or absent on the other. These differences could reflect a thematic division, different subjects discussed on different faces, or a formal division, different parts of a single text, such as a prayer and a response. The differences are real but subtle, and they do not by themselves support any specific interpretation. The third investigation is the one that the disc's admirers find most thrilling and its skeptics find most exasperating: the attempt to identify the content of the text from the pictographic imagery of the signs. This approach, sometimes called the iconographic approach, treats the disc's signs not as arbitrary phonetic symbols, but as meaningful pictures that depict the things they represent. Under this interpretation, the walking man represents a human or a god, the ship represents a sea voyage, the shield represents war or protection, and the cat represents a cat, a predator, or a deity associated with felines. By reading the signs as pictures, the interpreter attempts to reconstruct the narrative or thematic content of the text without knowing the language or the sound values. The results have been, predictably, creative and unverifiable. The disc has been read iconographically as a prayer to a mother goddess, as a record of a sea voyage, as a legal code, as a hymn, as a calendrical text, as a board game, and as a musical score. Each reading draws on a different selection of signs, emphasizes different iconographic connections, and produces a different narrative. The readings are limited only by the interpreter's imagination, and the imagination, unconstrained by linguistic evidence, is essentially unlimited. The fundamental problem with the iconographic approach is that it confuses the appearance of a sign with the function of a sign. In all known writing systems, the relationship between a sign's Wurzelform and its linguistic function is arbitrary. An Egyptian hieroglyph that depicts an owl does not mean owl. It represents the consonant M. A Mayan glyph that depicts a skull does not mean death. It represents the syllable cham. The pictographic origin of a sign tells you what the sign originally depicted, not what it came to represent in the writing system. And since writing systems evolve, since the original pictographic meanings are typically obscured by centuries of use and abstraction, the visual appearance of a mature writing system's signs is a deeply unreliable guide to their linguistic function. The Phaistos disc's signs are, by this standard, no more readable as pictures than Egyptian hieroglyphs are. The walking man might represent a human, or it might represent the sound of a syllable that has no connection to humanity. The ship might represent a voyage, or it might represent the sound of a word that means something entirely different. Without knowledge of the writing system's conventions, the pictures are noise, visually suggestive but linguistically meaningless. The iconographic approach is most famous and most cautionary. Example involves the so-called Phaistos game board hypothesis. In the 1990s, a self-published author proposed that the disc was not a text at all but a board game, a kind of ancient precursor to Snakes and Ladders, in which the spiral path represented the route of play and the signs represented different game positions. The hypothesis was creative, detailed, and utterly without supporting evidence. The author produced a complete set of rules for the game, including movement rules for different sign types, special positions that required specific actions, and a scoring system. The rulebook was longer than the disc itself. The hypothesis was dismissed by serious scholars, but it illustrates a general truth. The absence of constraints on interpretation makes every interpretation possible and none verifiable. The musicological interpretation, proposed by several scholars independently, deserves mention because it highlights a particularly creative approach to the disc's mysteries. The proponents argue that the sign groups represent musical phrases or rhythmic patterns, and that the disc is a notation for a musical composition or a chanted text. They point to the repetitive structure of the sign groups, the recurring sequences, the limited vocabulary, the formulaic patterns, as consistent with musical notation, in which a small set of melodic or rhythmic elements is combined and recombined to produce extended compositions. The spiral form of the disc is visually suggestive of a musical score, winding inward like a melody developing toward its climax. But the interpretation suffers from the same fundamental flaw as every other. It cannot be verified. No ancient musical notation from the Bronze Age Aegean has been identified. No system for converting the disc's signs into musical values has been established. The hypothesis is elegant, evocative, and completely untestable. The calendar hypothesis, advanced by several scholars including the archaeoastronomer Peter Aleph, proposes that the disk is an astronomical calendar, a device for tracking the movements of celestial bodies or the passage of seasons. The 61 sign groups, Aleph argues, may correspond to astronomical periods, perhaps lunar months, solar months, or some other calendrical unit. The spiral arrangement could represent the cyclical nature of time, the annual progression of seasons winding from beginning to end and starting again. The signs might represent stars, constellations, or seasonal markers. The calendar hypothesis has the advantage of explaining the disk's format. A circular object with a spiral text is a natural form for representing cyclical time. It has the disadvantage of explaining nothing else. The specific correspondences between sign groups and astronomical periods are arbitrary. The identification of individual signs as stars or seasons is subjective, and the hypothesis cannot explain why the disk was stamped rather than incised. A calendrical device does not require movable type. The proliferation of interpretations, prayers, games, music, calendars, legal documents, medical prescriptions, royal genealogies, is itself a phenomenon worthy of study. The Phaistos disk has attracted more creative misidentification per unit of text than any other artifact in history. The disk is a Rorschach test in clay, an ambiguous stimulus that each interpreter reads through the lens of their own expertise and preoccupations. The classicist sees Greek, the Semitist sees Semitic, the musician sees music, the astronomer sees stars. The disk reflects the analyst, not the artifact, and the reflections are endless because the disk itself provides no resistance, no feature that definitively excludes any interpretation. The fourth investigation is the mathematical analysis of the disk's information content, the attempt to determine, through quantitative methods, whether the text contains enough structure to represent a linguistic message. This approach, pioneered in the context of the Phaistos disk by the information theorist and linguist Kevin Knight, and further developed by the computational archaeologist Andreas Fulls, applies the tools of information theory to the disk's sign sequences. The key metric is entropy, a measure of the unpredictability or information density of a sequence. Natural languages have characteristic entropy values that reflect the predictability of their word and sentence structures. Purely random sequences have maximum entropy. Non-linguistic symbolic systems have entropy values that depend on their specific combinatorial rules. The entropy of the Phaistos disk's sign sequences has been calculated by several independent researchers, and the results are consistent. The disk's entropy falls within the range observed for natural languages. This is one of the strongest quantitative arguments for the disk's text being linguistic, rather than random or purely symbolic. But the argument is not decisive. The disk's corpus is so small that the entropy calculation has wide confidence intervals. The measured value is consistent with natural language, but it is also consistent with certain non-linguistic systems. The ambiguity cannot be resolved without a larger sample. Fulls has also examined the disk's sign sequences for evidence of Markov structure, the tendency of each sign to be influenced by the signs that precede it. His analysis found weak but measurable Markov effects, consistent with the sequential constraints that characterize natural language. But once again, the effects are not strong enough, given the small sample size, to be considered definitive. The mathematical evidence supports the linguistic hypothesis. It does not prove it. The mathematical analysis of the disk also raises a philosophical question that goes beyond the specific case of the Phaistos disk and touches on the foundations of how we study ancient inscriptions. How much data is enough? At what point does a corpus cross the threshold from too small to analyze to large enough to decode? The answer, which varies depending on the complexity of the writing system and the availability of external evidence, has never been precisely determined, but the Phaistos disk provides a lower bound. 242 signs is not enough. The disk demonstrates empirically that a corpus of this size cannot be deciphered from internal evidence alone. Any future attempt to establish a minimum corpus size for decipherment must take the disks as its starting point, as the proof that below a certain threshold, analysis fails completely. The implication is sobering. There may be other ancient inscriptions, scattered across museums and archaeological storerooms around the world that fall below the same threshold. Short texts in unknown scripts, found in isolation without bilingual parallels. These inscriptions, like the disc, may be permanently undecipherable, not because they are unimportant, but because they are too brief. The disc is the most famous member of this category, but it is not the only member. Every short, isolated inscription in an unknown script is, in principle, as undecipherable as the Phaistos disc. The disc is simply the largest and most studied example of a category that includes many smaller and less famous objects. The fifth investigation is the cultural contextual approach, the attempt to determine the disc's function not from its text, which cannot be read, but from its physical context and cultural parallels. This approach asks, what kinds of objects in the ancient Mediterranean world are disc-inscribed and designed for repeated production using pre-made type? The answer is surprisingly specific. Disc-shaped inscribed objects are rare in the Bronze Age Aegean, but they are not unknown. Circular clay objects bearing stamped or incised symbols have been found at several Minoan and Mycenaean sites, though none approaches the Phaistos disc in size, complexity, or the sophistication of its manufacturing technique. More suggestive are the stamped clay roundels found at several Cretan sites. Small, flat pieces of clay bearing impressions from administrative seals, apparently used as authentication tokens in the Minoan economic system. These roundels were produced by stamping, the same basic technique used on the Phaistos disc, and they served an administrative function within the palace bureaucracy. If the Phaistos disc is related to the roundel tradition, if it is, in effect, a large, elaborate roundel, then its function may be administrative rather than literary. It might be a certificate, a record, a contract, or an authorization of some kind. The sign groups might represent names, titles, quantities, or commodity designations rather than sentences in a language. This interpretation has the advantage of fitting the disc into a known category of Minoan object. It is not an entirely novel artifact, but an elaboration of an existing administrative tool. But the interpretation also has problems. The disc is far more elaborate than any known roundel. Its text is far longer. Its manufacturing technique, with 45 individual punches, is far more sophisticated. The spiral arrangement of the text is without parallel in the roundel tradition. If the disc is a roundel, it is a roundel that has been elevated to an entirely different level of complexity, a level that suggests a purpose beyond routine administration. The contextual approach also allows us to ask what the disc was not. It was not a seal. It is too large and too flat to have been used as a stamp or impression tool. It was not a weight. Its mass does not correspond to any unit in the known Minoan weight system. It was not a building element. It is too small and too fragile to serve a structural function. It was not a container lid. No container has been found that matches its dimensions. It was not a mirror. Its surface is not reflective. The process of elimination narrows the field of possible functions, but does not identify a specific one. The disc is none of the obvious things. It is something else, something for which no other example survives and no independent description exists. One additional contextual observation deserves attention. The room in which the disc was found, room 8 of the palace dependencies, also contained a linear A tablet, a small amount of burnt wood, and pottery fragments. The co-occurrence of the disc and the linear A tablet is significant because it demonstrates that two different writing systems were present in the same room, in the same destruction deposit, at the same site. This co-occurrence could mean that the two writing systems were used contemporaneously in the same cultural context, that the Minoans used linear A for some purposes and the disc's script for others, or it could mean that the disc was a foreign import, an object produced elsewhere, in a different writing tradition that ended up in a Minoan storeroom alongside local administrative documents. The co-occurrence raises more questions than it answers, but it suggests that the disc was not an isolated curio. It was, at least to the people who stored it, an object of sufficient importance to be kept in a room alongside the administrative records of the palace. The 5 investigations examined here, comparative, structural, iconographic, mathematical, and contextual, represent the major analytical approaches that have been applied to the Phaistos disk over the past century. Each has produced observations of genuine value. None has produced a decipherment. The disk remains what it has been since the day of its discovery, a small, beautiful, perfectly preserved object that says something that no one can understand, and that may, by the cold logic of information theory, be destined to remain forever silent. The investigations have also, collectively, produced a sobering meta-observation. The disk has been studied by comparative linguists, structural analysts, iconographers, information theorists, archaeologists, mathematicians, computer scientists, historians, astronomers, musicologists, and cryptographers. It has been examined using every analytical paradigm available to modern scholarship. And the result of this century-long multidisciplinary effort is not a solution but a demonstration. A demonstration that the disk lies beyond the reach of every existing analytical paradigm. The disk is not a difficult problem within a known framework. It is a problem that falls outside every known framework. No existing method is suited to it. No existing discipline has the tools to handle it. It is, in the most literal sense, unprecedented. And the appropriate response to the unprecedented is not another attempt at solution, but an honest acknowledgement of the limits of what can be known. The scholar and epigrapher Yves Duhoux, writing in the journal Cadmos, expressed this acknowledgement with a directness that is rare in academic literature. Attempts to interpret the Phaistos disk, Duhoux wrote, can at best be called imaginary. Whatever their supporters may say, no approach to the disk has any hope of leading to a plausible decipherment, let alone a definitive one. Any decipherment which does not rely on external evidence, such as a bilingual, and no such evidence exists, can only be called imaginative fiction. Duhoux's words are harsh. They are also, by the standards of the evidence, accurate. The disk is beyond the reach of scholarship, not beyond the reach of intelligence, not beyond the reach of effort, beyond the reach of the available evidence. And evidence, unlike intelligence and effort, cannot be increased by trying harder. It can only be increased by finding more, and more has not been found. There is a quality of the Phaistos disk that no academic analysis captures, a quality that is felt rather than measured, perceived rather than calculated. It is the quality of presence. The disk is small enough to hold in one hand. Its signs are detailed enough to see with the naked eye. Its surface is warm to the touch, or at least it was, before it was sealed behind glass in a museum case. It is, in a way that larger and more imposing artifacts are not, a human object. An object that was made by a human hand, held by a human hand, and used for a purpose that mattered to a human mind. Standing before it in the Heraclean Museum, you feel not the awe of distance, the grandeur at a remove that a pyramid or a cathedral inspires, but the intimacy of proximity. This object was held. This object was read. This object was meaningful to someone who was, in every biological and cognitive sense, exactly like you. The intimacy is what makes the incomprehension so painful. A pyramid is imposing from a distance. Its meaning, the glorification of a pharaoh, the preparation for an afterlife, is available to anyone who has read a chapter of Egyptian history. The disk is intimate from inches away. Its meaning is available to no one. The pyramid overwhelms and then explains itself. The disk invites and then refuses. The pyramid says, "Look at what I am." The disk says, "Look at what you cannot know." Every visitor to the Heraclean Museum who pauses before the disk's display case experiences a version of this refusal. Some visitors glance at it and move on, unaware of its significance. Others linger, drawn by the strangeness of the signs, the elegance of the spiral, the nagging sense that the object is trying to tell them something. A few stand for a long time, reading the museum label, studying the signs through the glass, trying to see through the opacity to whatever lies beneath. Those visitors are reenacting, in miniature, the century-long scholarly effort that has been devoted to the disk. They are trying to read it, they are failing, and they are feeling, in their brief moment before the case, the same frustration that has consumed the finest minds in epigraphy for over 100 years. And you cannot read it. The person who held it could read it. The person who made it could read it. The person for whom it was made could read it. You cannot. The gap between their comprehension and your incomprehension is not a gap of intelligence. There is no reason to suppose that the disk's creators were more intelligent than we are. It is a gap of knowledge, specifically, of a knowledge that has been lost so completely that it cannot be recovered from the evidence that survives. Let that sink in. The deeper truth of the Phaistos disk is not about linguistics or epigraphy or information theory. It is about the relationship between knowledge and survival, about the conditions that must be met for knowledge to persist across time. The disk's text was meaningful. It was shared. It was produced using a technology that implies a community of users. At some point in the Bronze Age, there existed a group of people, perhaps a scribal guild, perhaps a priestly order, perhaps a merchant network, who could read the disk's signs, who understood the language they recorded, and who produced and consumed documents in this script as part of their daily work. That community existed. Their knowledge was real, and it is gone. Not hidden, not waiting to be found, but gone, dissolved into the entropy of 3,500 years of cultural change. The knowledge died because the community died. Not biologically. The descendants of the disk's creators presumably continued to live on Crete, blending into the Mycenaean and later Greek populations that succeeded the Minoans. But culturally, the specific institutions, practices, and traditions that sustained the disk's script and language ceased to exist. The scribal guild was disbanded. The priestly order was absorbed. The merchant network was displaced. The children of the disk's creators grew up speaking a different language, writing in a different script, living in a different world. Within a generation or two, the disk's script was forgotten, not because anyone chose to forget it, but because no one chose to remember it. The knowledge was not destroyed. It was simply not transmitted. And knowledge that is not transmitted is knowledge that dies. This pattern, the death of knowledge through the failure of transmission rather than the violence of destruction, is the most common and the least dramatic form of knowledge loss. We tell stories about burning libraries and sacking cities because those events are dramatic. They have villains, they have victims, they have a narrative arc that satisfies our desire for causation and consequence. But the greatest losses of knowledge in human history were not dramatic. They were quiet. They were the moments when a master craftsman died without an apprentice, when a scribal school closed for lack of students, when a language shrank to its last dozen speakers, and then, one by one, they died, and the language died with them, and the knowledge it carried dissolved into the silence of the unspoken. The Phaistos disk is a monument to this quiet form of loss. It was not burned. It was not deliberately destroyed. It was not seized by a conqueror and smashed as an act of cultural vandalism. It was, by all indications, carefully stored in a room in a palace, preserved, maintained, treated as an object of value. The civilization that produced it did not destroy it. The civilization that succeeded it did not destroy it. It was preserved by the accident of fire and the patience of clay. It survived everything that should have destroyed it. Earthquake, conflagration, burial, 3.5 millennia of chemical and physical change. It did not survive the death of the knowledge required to read it. That knowledge was not stored in clay, it was stored in human minds. And human minds, unlike clay, do not survive for 3,500 years. The minds died, the knowledge died with them. The disk remained, a perfect vessel for a meaning that no longer has a home, a body without a soul, a voice without a language. The irony is almost unbearable. The disk was designed to preserve information. It was stamped, not incised, using a technology that implies mass production, standardization, and permanence. The craftsman who made the punches was investing in durability. The society that produced the disk was investing in communication, in the creation of a medium that could carry a message reliably and repeatedly. They succeeded. The medium is here. The message has been carried faithfully for 35 centuries, and it has arrived at its destination. The future, our present, in perfect condition, perfectly legible, and perfectly incomprehensible. The disk's creators could not have imagined this outcome. They could not have imagined that the script they used would fall out of use, that the language they spoke would die, that the culture they lived in would be replaced by another that could not read their writing. They inscribed their message with the confidence of people who expected it to be understood. That confidence was justified. For a time, the message was understood, the script was read, the language was spoken, the punches were used, the system worked, and then the system stopped working, not because it was flawed, but because the world in which it worked ceased to exist. This is the deepest lesson of the Phaistos disc, and it applies far beyond the ancient Mediterranean. Knowledge is not a substance. It is not stored in objects. It is stored in people, in the minds, hands, and habits of living human beings who learn it, practice it, and pass it on. Objects can preserve the traces of knowledge, the marks, the shapes, the configurations that knowledge produces. But the traces are not the knowledge. The knowledge is the understanding that connects the traces to their meanings. Without that understanding, the traces are decoration, beautiful, precise, and empty. The disc's traces are among the most beautiful and most precise in the history of human writing. The signs are crisp, the spiral is elegant, the clay is warm and smooth. The disc is, as a physical object, essentially perfect. A masterpiece of Bronze Age craftsmanship, preserved in flawless condition, radiating the quiet competence of its maker across 35 centuries of time. And it says nothing that anyone alive can understand. The perfection of the vessel only magnifies the emptiness of the cargo. This is not science fiction. This is the actual condition of the disc in the 21st century. The most studied undeciphered artifact in the world has resisted every analytical method, every computational algorithm, every scholarly intuition, and every amateur enthusiasm that has been directed at it for over 100 years. The disc is not yielding. It is not softening. It is not gradually becoming clearer as methods improve and data accumulates. It is as opaque today as it was in 1908. More data has not helped, because the only data that matters is data from outside the disk, and no external data has been found. And the most unsettling part? We may be doing the same thing right now, not with disks, with entire categories of knowledge. Every specialized skill that exists in the world today, every craft, every technique, every form of embodied expertise, is sustained by a community of practitioners who learn it, practice it, and teach it. If the community dissolves, if the practitioners retire without successors, if the market for the skill disappears, if the institution that sustained the training is defunded, the knowledge dies. Not gradually, abruptly. The last practitioner dies, and the knowledge they carried ceases to exist. The traces remain, the products, the tools, the records, but the understanding that animated them is gone. The Phaistos disc is one such trace. It is the product of a knowledge that once existed and that now does not. It is evidence, material, tangible, unambiguous evidence of a lost understanding. The signs were understood. The language was spoken. The script was used. The knowledge was real. And it is gone. As gone as the voice of the person who pressed the punches into the wet clay on a summer day in Bronze Age Crete more than 3,500 years ago. We cannot hear that voice. We cannot read those signs. We cannot recover the knowledge that connected them. The disc endures. The knowledge does not. And the gap between endurance and knowledge is the quiet, permanent, irreducible mystery at the heart of the Phaistos disc, and at the heart of the human relationship with its own past. Consider what we might have learned if the disc could be read. If it is a religious text, a prayer, a hymn, a ritual formula, it would provide the first direct evidence of Minoan religious language, the first words addressed by Minoan worshippers to their gods. This would transform our understanding of Minoan religion, which is currently reconstructed entirely from images and objects, from frescoes of ritual scenes, from figurines of snake goddesses, from the architectural remains of shrines and sanctuaries. Images can show what the Minoans did. Words could tell us what they believed. The difference between the two is the difference between watching a ceremony and understanding a theology. The disc, if it contains religious text, is the bridge between those two levels of understanding, and the bridge is unpassable. If the disc is an administrative document, a contract, a certificate, a record of obligations, it would provide the first direct evidence of Minoan legal or economic language. We know from the Linear A tablets that the Minoans maintained complex administrative records, inventories of goods, records of transactions, accounts of production. But the Linear A tablets, like the disc, cannot be read. The Minoan economic system, how it functioned, how it was regulated, how wealth was distributed, how disputes were resolved, is known only through inference from material remains. A single readable economic document would open a window into the daily life of the Minoan palace economy, a window that is currently closed. If the disc is a literary text, a poem, a myth, a historical narrative, its significance would be immeasurable. No Minoan literary text is known to exist. The Minoans left no surviving literature, no epic, no drama, no philosophical treatise, no personal letter. Their civilization, which produced art of extraordinary sophistication and beauty, appears to have left no verbal art, or at least no verbal art that survived the destruction of the palaces and the replacement of the Minoan language by Greek. A single literary text from the Minoan world would be one of the most important discoveries in the history of ancient literature. It would provide a direct encounter with the Minoan mind, unmediated by later Greek mythology, unfiltered by archaeological inference, spoken in the Minoan's own voice. Any of these possibilities, prayer, contract, poem, would be transformative. All of them are locked behind the same wall: the undeciphered script, the unknown language, the absent key. The disc sits in its case, containing knowledge that could reshape our understanding of one of the foundational civilizations of European history. And it says nothing that anyone can hear. The disc does not grieve for what it has lost. It is clay. It does not know that it once spoke and now does not. But we know. We stand before it in the museum, and we know that the small, warm, spiral-covered object in the glass case once meant something. Something specific, something definite, something that a human mind composed and a human hand inscribed. And we cannot reach it. The meaning is there, right there, on the surface, in the signs, in the spirals, preserved in fired clay for 35 centuries, and it is beyond our reach, permanently, quietly, absolutely. The Phaistos disc is often compared to other undeciphered artifacts, to the Voynich manuscript, to the Indus Valley seals, to the Rongorongo tablets of Easter Island. The comparison is natural but misleading, because the disc occupies a unique position among these objects. The Voynich manuscript is undeciphered but long. It contains enough text to support extensive statistical analysis and ongoing scholarly debate. The Indus Valley seals are individually short but collectively numerous. Over 4,000 inscribed objects provide a corpus that, while inadequate for decipherment, allows meaningful structural analysis. The Rongorongo tablets are few, and their provenance is contested, but they contain enough text to permit comparison between tablets and the identification of recurring patterns. The Phaistos disc has none of these advantages. It is short, it is singular. It has no corpus, it allows no comparison, it supports no statistical analysis of meaningful resolution. It is, in the landscape of undeciphered objects, the ultimate outlier, the object that represents the absolute minimum of data from which a decipherment might theoretically be attempted, and that falls below even that minimum. The disc's position at the extreme end of the undecipherability spectrum makes it a useful limit case, a test of how much can be determined from how little. The answer, after a century of effort, is very little. We can determine that the disc bears a writing system. We can determine that the writing system has approximately 45 signs. We can determine that the text is organized into groups that may represent words or phrases. We can determine that some signs show positional preferences. We can determine that some sign sequences recur. We can determine that the disc was stamped rather than incised. We can determine that it was made in the early to mid-second millennium before the Common Era. We cannot determine the language. We cannot determine the sound values of the signs. We cannot determine the meaning of any sign group. We cannot determine the purpose of the text. We cannot determine the origin of the script. We cannot determine the identity of the author or the intended audience. The list of what we know is short. The list of what we do not know is everything else. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. The Phaistos disc is the archaeological embodiment of this maxim. It is an object about which scholarship has been forced, after a century of sustained effort, to be largely silent. Not because there is nothing to say, but because everything that can be said has been said, and it amounts to very little. The observations have been made, the analyses have been performed, The hypotheses have been proposed and found wanting. What remains is the disk itself, small, silent, and perfect, sitting in its glass case in Heraklion, waiting for the discovery that would make it speak. That discovery may come. Archaeology is full of surprises. The Rosetta Stone was found by accident. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found by a shepherd boy chasing a goat. The Antikythera mechanism was found by sponge divers. The history of discovery is full of moments when the ground yielded something that transformed an entire field overnight. A second Phaistos disk, found at another site, bearing a different text in the same script, would double the corpus and potentially provide the comparative data that decipherment requires. A bilingual inscription, a text in both the disk script and a known language, would provide the key that would unlock everything. These discoveries are not impossible, they are merely improbable. And the improbable, in archaeology, sometimes happens. Until it does, if it does, the disk will remain what it is. The most eloquent silence in the history of human writing. A message sent across 35 centuries by a person who expected to be understood, received by a world that cannot understand it. A spiral of signs that winds inward toward a center that may contain a prayer, a record, a law, a song, or nothing at all. An object that is, in its small and perfect way, a monument to the fragility of everything that humans know, and to the permanence of the objects they leave behind. The clay endures, the knowledge does not, and the spiral turns inward and inward toward a silence that has no center and no end. What does the Phaistos disk teach us? Not about Bronze Age Crete. The disk has taught us almost nothing about Bronze Age Crete, because it cannot be read. Not about ancient writing systems. The disk has told us almost nothing about ancient writing systems, because it cannot be compared to any other. What the disk teaches us is something more fundamental and more unsettling. It teaches us about the limits of knowledge itself. The Phaistos disk is a limit case. It represents the absolute boundary of what scholarship can extract from a single, short, isolated artifact in an unknown script, recording an unknown language. That boundary, as a century of effort has demonstrated, lies very close to zero. We can observe, we can describe, we can catalogue, we can measure, we can count, but we cannot understand. The disk is an object that can be known in every physical detail and understood in no semantic detail. An object that is completely transparent to science and completely opaque to comprehension. The physics of the disk are clear, the chemistry of the disk is clear, the archaeology of the disk, while imperfect, is adequate. The linguistics of the disk are entirely beyond our reach. This disjunction between physical knowledge and semantic understanding is the disk's most important lesson. We live in a culture that equates knowledge with understanding, that assumes physical analysis can eventually yield comprehension of any object. The disk refutes this assumption. It demonstrates there exist objects that are physically knowable and semantically unknowable. Objects for which no amount of physical analysis, however precise and however exhaustive, can produce understanding. The meaning of the disk is not encoded in its physics. It is encoded in a relationship between the signs and a language, and the language is gone. No amount of physical analysis can recover a lost language from a clay disk. The physics and the semantics occupy different planes. The disk is fully present on one plane and entirely absent on the other. The journey of this story began with an Italian archaeologist lifting a small disk from the earth in 1908. It ends with the recognition that the disk he found may never be understood, not because it is too complex, but because it is too alone. The disk's isolation, its singularity, its lack of parallels, its disconnection from any known linguistic or scribal tradition, is not a feature that future scholarship can overcome. It is a permanent condition. Unless a second disk is found, unless the ground yields the parallel that would transform the problem, the disk will remain forever singular, forever isolated, and forever silent. The connection between the opening of this story and this moment is direct. We began with a disk in a display case, a small, ordinary-looking object that conceals the most extraordinary mystery in the history of human writing. We end with the recognition that the mystery may not have a solution, that the disk may be permanently undecipherable, not because we lack the intelligence to read it, but because the information required to read it no longer exists. The disk is not a puzzle waiting for a clever mind. It is a question to which the answer has been destroyed. The destruction was not deliberate. It was not violent. It was the natural consequence of 3.5 millennia of cultural change, during which the language, the script, the scribal tradition, and the community that sustained them all quietly ceased to exist. Are we making the same mistakes? The question echoes through every discussion of the disk, and it applies with uncomfortable directness to the modern world. We, too, produce objects that encode meaning in fragile codes, digital codes that depend on specific hardware, specific software, and specific institutional structures for their readability. We, too, assume that what we write today will be readable tomorrow. We, too, invest in durability of medium without investing equally in durability of code. The disk's clay, has lasted for 35 centuries. The language that gave its signs meaning lasted for a few hundred years at most. The medium outlasted the message by a factor of 10. Our digital media will not last 35 centuries, but our digital codes, the file formats, the encryption standards, the software protocols, are already becoming obsolete within decades. We face the same disjunction that produced the disk's silence. A medium that endures and a code that does not. The Phaistos disk is a warning, not a dramatic warning, not a warning about fire or war or conquest, a quiet warning, a warning about the ordinary, unremarkable, inevitable process by which knowledge is lost. The process of forgetting. The disk's creators did not forget their script. Their descendants forgot it. Their successors forgot it. The chain of transmission broke, not because anyone cut it, but because no one maintained it. And a chain of transmission, once broken, cannot be retied. The knowledge does not decay gradually, growing fainter over time like an echo. It vanishes suddenly, completely, at the moment the last link breaks. One generation knows, the next does not. The discontinuity is absolute. We assume that writing is a defense against forgetting. The Phaistos disk reveals that writing is only as strong as the weakest link in the chain that connects it to its readers. The clay is strong. The signs are sharp. The script is a technological achievement, the product of a sophisticated community that developed a stamping technique centuries before the invention of the printing press. But the chain, the living chain of speakers, readers, and scribes who maintained the connection between the signs and their meanings, was not strong enough. It broke, and when it broke, the technology became meaningless. The most advanced writing technology in the Bronze Age Aegean produced an artifact that is, today, less informative than a child's drawing, because a child's drawing, however crude, is in a language we understand. This is not an indictment of the disk's creators. They did everything right. They invested in a durable medium. They used a reproducible technology. They produced a clear, legible text. They did everything that a civilization can do to ensure that its messages endure. And their messages have endured, perfectly, magnificently, for 35 centuries. The messages are here. The meaning is not. The failure was not in the technology. The failure was in the assumption that technology is sufficient, that a durable medium and a clear inscription are enough to carry a message across time. They are not enough. They are necessary, but not sufficient. The sufficient condition is the survival of the code, the living language, the shared understanding, the community of readers, and that condition, which no technology can guarantee, was not met. The disk is the residue of that failure, the beautiful, heartbreaking residue of a communication that succeeded in every technical dimension and failed in the only dimension that matters, the dimension of comprehension. The message was sent, the message arrived, the message was not received, and the gap between arrival and reception, the gap where the lost language should be, is the permanent, irreducible, magnificent silence of the Phaistos disk. The disk is the residue of that discontinuity. It is the physical trace of a knowledge that was once alive and is now dead. It sits in its case in Heraklion, surrounded by the artifacts of a civilization that also cannot be fully understood, surrounded by texts in a script that also cannot be read, in a museum that is itself a monument to the incompleteness of human memory. The museum preserves what can be preserved, the objects, the forms, the physical traces. It cannot preserve what cannot be preserved, the meanings, the words, the understanding. The gap between what is preserved and what is lost is the gap at the center of all archaeology. The Phaistos disc is that gap made manifest, a tangible, holdable, visible embodiment of everything that human memory has let slip through its fingers. The disc also raises a question that is rarely asked in discussions of undeciphered scripts. What would we do with the decipherment if we had it? The assumption behind every decipherment effort is that the content of the text is valuable, that reading the disc would produce information worth having. But what if the disc's content is mundane? What if it records nothing more than a list of names, a tax receipt, a shipping manifest? Would the decipherment still be significant? The answer is emphatically yes. Even a mundane text, in a script that has never been read, would be a breakthrough of the first order, because the value of a decipherment lies not in the content of the specific text that is deciphered, but in the key that the decipherment provides. If the disc could be read, the reading would establish the sound values of 45 signs and the identity of the language they record. That key could then be applied to any other inscription in the same script that might be found in the future. The first decipherment is always the hardest. Once the key is established, subsequent readings become progressively easier. A single mundane text, correctly deciphered, is worth more than a library of proposed decipherments, because it provides the verified foundation on which all subsequent work can build. This is why the disc's undecipherability is not merely an academic inconvenience. It is a permanent closure of a pathway to knowledge. Without the key, no future discovery of inscriptions in the same script can be read. The disc is not just a single unreadable text. It is the lock on every text that was ever written in the same script. Every inscription that might yet be found, on a second disc, on a pottery shard, on a stone block buried somewhere in the ruins of Bronze Age Crete, will be equally unreadable unless the key is found first. The disc's silence is not local, it is systemic. It closes off not just its own content, but the content of an entire writing tradition. This systemic quality of the loss makes the disc's uniqueness even more devastating. If multiple examples of the disc's script existed, the cumulative data might eventually provide the statistical basis for a decipherment. Even without a bilingual text, a large enough corpus might allow internal reconstruction of the language, but the disc is alone. The corpus consists of a single document, and a single document, however perfectly preserved, is not a corpus. It is a sample of one, and a sample of one, in any scientific discipline, supports no generalizations, no patterns, and no conclusions, and the gap is growing. Every year, languages die. Every year, crafts are forgotten. Every year, skills that took generations to develop are abandoned because the economic conditions that sustained them no longer exist. Every year, the sum of human knowledge that is held in living minds, rather than in archives, databases, or museums, shrinks. The Phaistos disc is not an anomaly. It is a preview. It is what the future looks like for any knowledge that is held by a small community. And that depends, for its survival, on the continued existence of that community. When the community goes, the knowledge goes, and all that remains is the traces, the marks on clay, the patterns on stone, the objects in museum cases that once meant everything and now mean nothing. In the Heraclean Archaeological Museum, in a room on the ground floor, there is a glass case that stands apart from the more crowded displays of Minoan pottery and jewellery. Inside the case, on a plain mount, sits the Phaistos disc. It is smaller than most visitors expect. It is plainer than most visitors expect. It does not gleam or glitter. It does not dominate its space. It sits quietly on its mount and it waits. The answer to the question posed by the title of this documentary is this: the Phaistos disc cannot be explained. It cannot be explained because it cannot be read, and it cannot be read because the information required to read it. A second disc, a bilingual inscription, a related script, a known language does not exist. Every proposed explanation is, by the standards of the available evidence, an act of imagination rather than an act of scholarship. Every claimed decipherment is, in the strict methodological sense, fiction, a story imposed on the data rather than derived from it. The disc sits in its case, as undeciphered as the day it was found, and every scholar who has worked on it for the past century has, in the end, been defeated by the same implacable obstacle. The absence of the information that decipherment requires. This is an honest answer. It is not a satisfying answer. It is not the answer that the disk seems to promise. The disk, with its crisp signs and its confident spiral, seems to say, I am readable. I was read. I can be read again. The disk's visual clarity mocks the semantic opacity. The signs are right there. You can see them. You can count them. You can photograph them and enlarge them and trace them and classify them. You can hold the disk in your hands, or rather, you once could, before it was sealed behind glass, and feel the impressions with your fingertips. The signs are physical. They are present. They are as accessible as any marks on any object in any museum in the world, and they are as meaningless to any living reader as random scratches on a rock. The disk has been waiting for over a century for someone to read it. It will continue to wait. It has all the time in the world. Clay does not tire. Clay does not give up. Clay does not grow frustrated by the failure of generation after generation of scholars to crack its code. Clay just waits. And the signs on its surface, the walking man, the plumed head, the ship, the shield, the flower, the fish, the cat, wait with it, frozen in the moment of their creation, as clear and as legible and as meaningless as they have been for 35 centuries. If every undeciphered artifact in the world could be assembled in a single room, the Phaistos disk, the Linear A tablets, the Indus Valley seals, the Rongorongo tablets, the Proto-Elamite tablets, the Cypro-Minoan inscriptions, the room would contain a collection of objects whose combined muteness would be deafening. Each object represents a voice that once spoke and is now silent. Each object represents a knowledge that once lived and is now dead. Each object is a monument to the fragility of meaning in a universe that preserves form but not content. The Phaistos disk would be the smallest object in the room. It would also be the most mysterious, the object with the fewest parallels, the shortest text, the most complete isolation, and the most thorough resistance to analysis. The disk is a spiral. The text winds inward from the edge toward the center. Whether it is read from outside to center or from center to outside, the direction is the same. Inward, toward the center, toward the core, toward the heart of the mystery. The spiral narrows as it approaches the center. The sign groups grow shorter. The space between the lines tightens. And at the center, at the very heart of the spiral, where the text ends and the clay is blank, there is nothing, a small circle of empty clay, the end of the message, or the beginning. Nobody knows which. The blank center of the disk is, in a sense, the perfect symbol for the entire mystery. The spiral leads inward, through sign after sign, group after group, promising a destination, promising a revelation, promising that at the center of the spiral there will be an answer. And at the center there is nothing, just clay, just silence, just the end of a message that was never finished, or a message that was finished and that has, in the end, said nothing that anyone living can understand. The disk was found in the ruins of a palace that was destroyed by fire. The fire baked the clay. The baked clay preserved the signs. The signs survived the fire, the burial, the millennia, the excavation, and the century of scholarly scrutiny that followed. Everything about the disk has survived. Everything except the one thing that would make it meaningful: the knowledge of what it says. Someone knew. Someone 3,500 years ago held this disk and read it. They knew what the walking man meant. They knew what the plumed head signified. They knew the language, the script, the system, the purpose. They held in their mind the key that would unlock the spiral. That key was passed from mind to mind, from generation to generation, from teacher to student, from parent to child, until the chain broke, and the key was lost, and the disk fell silent. The loss was not sudden. It was gradual, the slow erosion of a living tradition over generations. As the language changed, the script fell out of use, the scribal community shrank, and the knowledge that had sustained the disk's readability contracted until it occupied a single mind, and then no mind at all. The last reader of the Phaistos disk, the last human being who could hold the disk, trace the spiral with a finger, and understand the words that the signs encoded, died sometime in the second millennium before the Common Era on the island of Crete, in a world that had already moved on to other scripts and other languages. No one recorded the moment. No one noticed the loss. The disk was already buried under rubble and ash, waiting in the darkness for the Italian archaeologist, who would find it 35 centuries later and hold it up to the light, turning it over in his hands, studying the signs with the bewildered attention of a man who has found something extraordinary and who cannot, for the life of him, determine what it is. Pernier could not read the disc. A century of scholars after him could not read the disc, and the disc, which has been patient for 35 centuries, can afford to wait a few centuries more. Clay is patient. Clay endures. Clay does not care whether it is understood. It simply persists, holding its signs, holding its secret, holding the memory of a voice that spoke once and that speaks no more. The silence has lasted 3,500 years. It may last forever. There is a peculiar form of beauty in this silence. The disc is, as a physical object, one of the most aesthetically satisfying artifacts of the ancient world. Its circular form is pleasing. Its spiral text is elegant. Its signs are detailed, varied, and full of life. Walking men, leaping fish, soaring birds, sailing ships. The craftsmanship is superb. The design is harmonious. The disc is considered purely as a work of visual art, a masterpiece of Bronze Age craftsmanship, an object that rewards the eye even as it defeats the mind. This aesthetic satisfaction is part of the disc's power and part of its cruelty. A beautiful object that can be understood is a joy. A beautiful object that cannot be understood is a torment. A reminder that beauty and meaning are not the same thing, that an object can be exquisite without being comprehensible, that the eye can be satisfied while the mind remains starved. The disc satisfies the eye, it starves the mind, and the gap between satisfaction and starvation is the space in which the disc's mystery lives. The disc will endure, the silence will endure. The spiral will continue to turn, inward and inward and inward, toward a center that holds nothing but the absence of everything it once contained. The signs are there, the meaning is gone,